Welcome to week 3, social psychology. Today we're going to talk about person perception. So we start talking about person perception by talking about attribution theory. Attributions are the explanations that we give for other people's behaviors, for other experiences that we have. When we're making an attribution, we're asking the question, why did something happen to us? Now, most often we're asking this question when we've experienced something negative. If you find $100 on the street, you don't really stop to ask, why did I find $100 on the street? But that's a positive event. We like those things. We don't really want to question them. We do ask these questions though when we experience negative events. So for example, when someone does something to us and it causes us to feel bad or to have some kind of negative outcome, then we're interested in knowing, why did that person do that? Typically what we're going to do is we're going to try to self-enhance when we're talking about why we do the things that we do. So for example, if we have a success in life, we do well on an exam, it's because of something that we did. It's something about us personally. I did well in the exam because I studied, because I'm smart, because I put in the work. On the other side of that coin, if something bad happens to us, something negative, we make what we call external attributions. Right? It's something about the world. It's something about the situation. Right? If I fail a test, it's because the teacher's a bad teacher, or because the questions were too hard, or because the teacher didn't give us enough time to study, or something like this. It's something about the environment. Now, attribution theory comes from a famous social psychologist called Fritz Heider. Heider talks about people being naive scientists, and that's this idea that people, in a way, behave like scientists in their lives. They spend time observing other people, they spend time observing their interactions, and they come up with causal explanations for why things happen in their social world. We make attributions for other people's behaviors, and we do this in two different ways. There's two different kinds of attributions we can make. Similar to the internal-external distinction we make for our own behaviors, we can attribute other people's behaviors to being personal, so that's something about who they are as a person, or situational. And this, again, maps onto this internal-external distinction. I kind of use these interchangeably. So a personal attribution is a person does something because of who they are, right? It's something about them. Versus a situational attribution is something that is about the situation. It's not about who they are, it's because of something external to them. Again, internal and external. So if I look at a student and they fail the test, and I say, this student failed the test because they are not very smart, right? That would be a personal attribution, something about them. If I say this student didn't do well on the test because they had a childcare situation and they missed a couple classes and they didn't have a chance to study, right? That would be situational. It's not about them, it's about the particular situation, right? A personal attribution, we would expect that person to behave the same way in the future. A situational attribution, we wouldn't necessarily expect that, right? Because it's something about the situation. The fundamental attribution error, huge idea in social psychology, is this tendency to attribute other people's behaviors to the personality. So in general, when we look at other people's behaviors, we tend to make personal attributions. We tend to see other people's behaviors as something about themselves. So if you see this video, I'm not sure how well this is going to play on YouTube, but if you watch this little video here, you see this guy fly through this intersection. And usually about now is when students notice the car fly through and almost get into an accident. So the question is, why does this person do this? Why does this person behave the way they do? You might say this person is a bad driver or they're reckless. Right? That would be a personal attribution. You might also say maybe there's a person in the car who's dying and they're on the way to the hospital. And that would be a situational attribution. Many times we have this experience in Chicago, right? You're pulled up to an intersection, and it's one of those classic Chicago intersections that's got, it's a three-way intersection with three different streets intersecting, and cars are backed up, half a block down, and all of a sudden here comes this person zipping up on the right-hand side and going all the way up to the front of the line of cars, and then jumping out in the intersection and merging in. And maybe you're the person who does that, or maybe you've seen someone do that. But the question is, why do they do that? You could say they're rude. You could say, they're selfish. They only care about each other, or they only care about themselves. Or you might say maybe there's a pregnant woman in the car, and that's why they have to get to the hospital. Right? But the point here is that we can make these personal or situational attributions, but what we tend to do is we tend to make personal attributions. We can make situational attributions, and we do, and we'll talk about when we do, but we typically tend to make personal attributions. And we tend to ignore these situational influences on people's behavior. So here's an example of this. A classic study done in the 1960s, back when Fidel Castro and the Cold War was sort of coming to the height of the Cold War. And what the purpose of the study was to have participants guess the attitude of an essay writer. So what they did is they had people ostensibly write an essay about Fidel Castro, and the essays were either pro-Fidel Castro or anti-Fidel Castro. You can sort of think about this as a proxy in the 1960s, pro-communism versus anti-communism. And then, so the participants were either randomly assigned to a pro-Fidel Castro or anti-Fidel Castro group. And then the participants were told either that the person who wrote the essay could choose which of the two essays they wrote, or that they were forced to write the essay. Now, if they're forced to write the essay, this is a serious situational constraint, right? This means that this situation is having a huge impact on what the content of the essay. If you're forced to write the essay, it has a huge impact. Versus if you choose to write the essay, the situation really has no impact. And then at the very end, they were asked to guess the true attitudes of the essayist. So here's what we find. So when the person chose to write the essay, then you would assume that the essay content accurately reflects their attitudes, right? The people who chose the pro-Castro essay probably are pro-Castro. The people who chose the anti-Castro essay are probably anti-Castro. But what's wacky about this study is we get this same pattern even when the essay was forced, even when they had no choice. And in that case, the content of the essay can't really tell us anything about their true attitudes. And yet, we still see this same pattern, this same fundamental attribution error, right? Attributing people's behaviors to their personality and ignoring situational constraints. Now, we can take this fundamental attribution error one step further, and we can talk about this actor-observer difference, or the actor-observer bias. So we tend to make personal attributions for other people's behaviors, but we also tend to make situational attributions for our own behaviors, right? So when we make a personal attribution for someone else's behavior, we call this the fundamental attribution error. When we make situational attributions for our own behavior, we call this the actor-observer difference, right? So we tend to see other people's behaviors in terms of their personality. It's something fundamental about them. But our own behaviors, we can always explain away in terms of the situation. That's not really about us. And if you think back to self-enhancement from the beginning, right, we tend to want to feel good about ourselves. So if something positive happens, it's something about me, internal attribution. If something negative happens, it's something about the situation. It's not about me. Right, so if someone argues with the grocery clerk, if someone argues with someone at a store, it's because they're rude. If you argue with the clerk, it's because you're having a bad day. Again, this illustration of personal versus situational. One interesting piece about this actor-observer difference is that it has to do with perception. So if you imagine yourself walking around in the world, when you are observing your own behavior, you're observing it from your perspective. And what you're looking at is the situation. In contrast, when we look at other people, what we see is other people in the situation. We see the person rather than the environment, right? Whereas when we see our own behavior, we only see the environment. So interesting study of Storms 1973. They had two people seated in a room across from each other, and they had a camera behind each person's head. And they videotaped this interaction. And then they asked them later questions about the experience. And they showed them either their own perspective, right? So the camera behind my head viewing my partner would be what I would see from my own perspective, or the camera behind their partner's head viewing themselves. And when they were shown their own perspective, right, they made this sort of classic actor-observer difference. They saw the situation from their own perspective, and so they viewed their own behavior as due to the situation. But what was interesting about this is that when they were shown their partner's perspective, in other words, when the video that they watched of their own behavior was a video of them, when they're looking at themselves behaving from that third-person perspective, then they were more likely to make personal attributions, even though it was their own behavior, which suggests that part of this actor-observer difference has to do with perspective. It has to do with the fact that we only see the situation when we're thinking about our own behavior. When we're thinking about other people, we see that person acting in the environment. Now, what's crazy about this, and this is a theme that we're gonna touch upon this week and in future weeks, is that some of these processes are relatively automatic, right? We do this without thinking about it. And we talked about this last week with that hot and cold study. The idea was that just holding on to that hot cup of coffee automatically activated in people's brains the idea of warmth. And that idea of warmth was activated at a subconscious level, which then influenced how they perceived other people. So these automatic processes happen, but we can correct for them, right? The problem with correcting, though, is that it requires cognitive effort, right? We automatically make personal attributions, and then if we have the time, energy, motivation, we can go back and correct for that to look at those situational influences. Oftentimes when I talk about this in class, people will say, well, I certainly pay attention to situational influences. And people do, but only if they have the time, the energy, and the motivation to do so. Now, this distinction between automatic and controlled, we haven't really gotten into, so this is a point at which I'd like to kind of expand on this. So automatic processes are things that our brain does outside of our conscious awareness. There is a tremendous amount of information processing that happens before conscious awareness. If you recall from intro psychology, the amount of information that is coming into, let's just say, your visual system is receiving light energy, and that's getting transferred into neural impulses in your eye. And all of that information is traveling back to your brain in your occipital lobe and getting put together and constructed into a visual scene. And your brain is processing light and dark and horizontal lines and vertical lines and faces and all of these different things and motion. And all of that's getting processed outside of your conscious awareness. And we are only aware of this sort of end result, which is our visual perception. Right? So automatic processing is really fast. Controlled processes, these sort of conscious processes, these tend to be slow. Automatic processes tend to be non-conscious. Controlled processes tend to be conscious. Another thing about automatic processes is that they're hard to stop, right? They happen outside of our conscious awareness, and controlled processes, we have a lot of control over. Another distinction between automatic and controlled processes are that automatic processes, we don't really have to spend time on it. Our brain just does this for us, whereas controlled processes take time. An example of this sort of distinction is if you've known anyone who's ever had to learn to drive stick shift. Driving a manual transmission at first takes a lot of effort. You have to think about, okay, foot on the clutch, put the stick into first gear, slowly let your foot off the clutch as you're giving it gas. And then as you start to accelerate, you have to, put your foot on the clutch, take your foot off the gas, and change gears, right? That process of learning to drive stick shift is not that easy. So at first it starts out controlled, but through practice and experience, it becomes automatic. At some point, when you learn to drive stick shift, you don't even think about shifting anymore. It just happens automatically. We'll spend a lot of time over the rest of the semester talking about some of the distinctions between automatic and controlled processes. Here's another example. So the Stroop task. Oops, sorry, back up. So what I want you to do is tell me what the color of the word is, right? So I give you this word, tell me what the color is. If you're familiar with this, what you find is that reading of the word is automatic, right? Reading color is not. Right? So if you've got a good experience with reading, you're very well literate, reading happens automatically. And so when I ask you identify the color of the word green, reading of the word green, interferes with your ability to say that the color is red. The word blue interferes with your ability to say that the color is yellow. Okay? And so again, the idea here is that these automatic processes are automated and efficient. They happen outside of our conscious awareness, whereas controlled processes like saying the color, right, require effort. There are two steps in this attribution process. First is this characterization. This is the first step in this fundamental attribution error, inferring personality from behavior. We can then go back and correct for these things. Right? So there are times when we can go back and correct. So if you think about the video, the image of the car going through the intersection really fast and recklessly, at first you might think, wow, what a terrible driver. And that would be characterization. And if you have the time, the energy, and the motivation, you might go back and say, well, maybe there was an emergency. Maybe there's something else going on about the situation that influenced that behavior. You can augment or discount your initial characterization. But if we don't have the mental resources, we don't usually correct for personality attributions. If we're preoccupied, if we're thinking about other things, if our cognitive capacity is taxed, we're busy thinking about other things, then we typically just stick with step one. We infer personality from behavior and don't bother to go back and correct. So you might say to yourself, well, if people are going through the world making this fundamental attribution error, why hasn't the world gone haywire? What is the benefit for us of doing this? And one of the issues here is that oftentimes the situations, oftentimes people choose the situations that they are in, right? So if we see a librarian in a library and we infer things about that person based on that situation, we say, well, this person must be quiet, they must like order, these kinds of things. That might actually end up being a pretty good assumption because people choose the situations that they're in. However, situations do change people as well. We can also talk about motivational biases, right? Sometimes we have a particular motivation to view a situation a particular way. So, for example, in this, I can't say this person's name, in the Dunning 2005 study, they brought participants into the lab and they told them that they'd either be tasting some orange juice, which is pretty good, or they'd have to drink this foul-tasting drink. Okay, so they say, come in and say, you're in for the study, and either you're going to drink orange juice or you're going to drink this really disgusting, foul-tasting drink. And which condition you're going to be in depends on whether we see a letter or a number on the computer screen. So the computer is going to present us with a letter or a number, and then that'll be which group you're in. Half of them were told that a letter meant that they would get to go into the orange juice group, right? Which is preferable. No one wants to drink the disgusting drink. Half of them were told that a number would put them into the orange juice group. And then, here's the fun part, they were all shown this image, right? And this image could be interpreted either way, right? It could be interpreted as a B, or it could be interpreted as a 13. And I bet you can guess how people interpreted it, right? The people who were told that if they saw a letter, they'd get to drink the orange juice and not the disgusting drink, saw it as a B. The people who were told that if it was a number, they would get to drink the orange juice and not the disgusting drink, they saw it as a 13. Right? So this gets at this idea that sometimes we are motivated to see what we want to see. So the fundamental attribution error, as it's called, may not be the worst mental shortcut to use, right? We may be wrong when we're making fundamental attribution error, but we may be right as well. When we're wrong, it's typically not a big deal, especially if these are just people that we see out in the world that we're not going to see again. But sometimes we can come into problems if we see people in situations that we're not used to seeing them in. So, for example, if we see Lady Gaga wearing a meat dress, right, we might think that she's crazy. We might think that she's an artist expressing herself. But we might see her that same way when she's holding a baby. And, you know, we might see that situation a little bit differently. So another mental shortcut that we use is what we call the confirmation bias. Once we form an impression of other people, we use that information to create expectations about how they will behave in the future. And then what we do is we look for information that confirms those expectations and ignore information that disconfirms those expectations. So here's a classic study. So students are brought into the lab and they're told that they're going to interview another student who is either an introvert or an extrovert. Now these labels are completely random. They were just randomly told they was going to interview an introvert or an extrovert. And then what they did was they were given a list of questions that they could use during the interview. And they were told that they could choose what questions to ask this person. And those who were told they were interviewing an extrovert picked questions that would reveal an extroverted personality. Questions like, what would you do to lighten up a party? People who were told that they were interviewing an introvert chose questions that would reveal an introverted personality. And so what happened was that participants' responses actually made them look more extroverted and more introverted because the interviewer was selecting questions that would bring that those personality characteristics to the forefront. Here's another study. So this is a classic study called the Hannah study. So participants watched a videotape of a 4th grade girl named Hannah, and she was playing in her neighborhood. And the neighborhood was either set up to be an urban, relatively low socioeconomic status neighborhood, a poor neighborhood, or a relatively suburban, upper middle class, wealthy neighborhood. And then half of them saw her taking a test, taking an achievement test. Now they all saw her take the same, so half of them saw her take an achievement test, half of them didn't see anything. They just saw her playing in the neighborhood. And then they asked, half of them viewed her taking this achievement test. And on the achievement test, she made some mistakes. She got some right, got some wrong, but more or less, it was the same. It was the same tape for both groups. And then they asked them how well they thought she did on the test. Now, when they didn't actually get a chance to view her on the test, right? So when they just viewed her playing in the neighborhood and they said, she took this intelligence test, this achievement test, how well do you think that she did? The people who viewed her in the low socioeconomic status neighborhood, you know, they said that she probably made about the same mistakes, but slightly worse performance compared to the people who viewed her in the wealthy neighborhood. So in other words, this information about the neighborhood that she lives in didn't really have an influence on how they perceived her performance on the test. But here's what's interesting. When they watched her take the test, now they all watched her take the same test, watching her take the test allowed those participants to use that information about what neighborhood she lived in to confirm their expectations. So if they viewed her in the poor neighborhood, they confirmed their expectations of poor performance by predicting that she did much worse, she made more mistakes versus the wealthy neighborhood. Oops. Thank you. Versus the wealthy neighborhood, where they predicted that she would make fewer mistakes and actually do better. So what's interesting about this study is that people were using this confirmation bias, right? They wanted to confirm their expectations about Hannah based on the neighborhood that she lived in, but they only did that when they had information to consider, right? They didn't do that in the condition where they didn't actually get to view her taking the test. So what's interesting about this is that we have to be aware that when we meet people, we are looking for information that confirms our expectations, and we are discrediting or ignoring information that disconfirms our expectations. And again, this will come into play later on when we talk about prejudice and discrimination. So one of the takeaways here is that a lot of people sort of believe that, I'll believe it when I see it. But in reality, typically when they see it when they believe it. Right? In other words, they look for what they already expect. And these expectations are really powerful, and we'll talk about a couple studies next that sort of reveal these expectations. The good news is sometimes we are motivated to form correct impressions. So if we're going to be working with people, if we have an outcome that we're working together with some other people, then we're much more interested in getting an accurate impression of that person. So if you're going to be working with someone in my experimental Psych 4100 class, you're going to want to make sure that your impression of them is accurate. If I give you a reward for being accurate, of course, then you're going to be more motivated to be accurate as well. In these situations, we are more likely to consider all sources of information and less motivated to just sort of confirm our initial bias or expectation. Now, we've talked about how our expectations can influence how we perceive other people's behavior through this confirmation bias. But what's interesting about our expectations is that our expectations can not only influence how we perceive other people's behavior, we can actually influence other people's behavior based on our expectations. So, for example, the expectations that we have for other people can actually change their behaviors to become more consistent with our expectations. So here's an example. So Rosenthal and I want to say Fode or Fod, 1963, they're working with some rats. And they're really interested in this idea of this expectations or expectancy effects. And so what they did was they brought some graduate students into their research lab, and they had them working with rats. And if you're familiar with the way that these rat labs go, you got to imagine a room with a bunch of rats in cages, and they require care, so they have to be taken out. Their cages have to be cleaned, and they have to be fed and watered, and these kinds of things. And what the researchers did is they had these graduate students come in, and the graduate students were, their job was to clean and take care of these rats, but also to run these rats in mazes, right? To teach these rats to run mazes. And what they were told was that half of the rats were maze bright. They're just genetically smarter rats. And they were told the other half were maze dull, that they were genetically inferior rats or genetically less intelligent. Now, in reality, these labels were random. They were just randomly given this description. And what they found was that the rats that were labeled smart, the rats that were labeled maze bright, ended up running the mazes faster than those labeled maze dull. And so the question is why? If they're identical rats, or genetically identical rats, the only thing that is different between the groups of rats is this random label that is given to them. Why are the maze bright rats doing better at these mazes? And they hypothesized that it is the expectations of the graduate students that led the rats to do better. Maybe the research assistants treated them better. Maybe they paid them a little bit more attention. Maybe they held them a little bit longer. But there was something about their expectations that was getting transferred to these rats. Now, if you sort of buy into this, if you believe this research result, this has some pretty powerful implications for people. So for example, Rosendahl and Jacobson did this classic Pygmalion in the Classroom study, where they came in and they gave a bunch of kids in a classroom, school classroom, an intelligence test. And then they told the teacher that some of the students were late bloomers. Now, this was based on bogus information, right? They were just making this up. They randomly picked some students to be late bloomers. And what this meant, they told the teachers, was that these students were going to experience a rapid and tremendous increase in their academic growth over the course of the year. They also told, and they never told, the kids are never told about their performance. Right? The kids are never given this information. The only person who gets this information is the teacher. And then they measured their IQ scores at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year. And what they found was that these students who were labeled late bloomers, and again, this is a random label, right? They didn't tell the parents, they didn't tell anyone else, they just told the teachers, these students are going to have this tremendous academic growth. Their IQ scores went up 4 times as much as the other students in the class. So in other words, what happened was that the late bloomers were chosen randomly, but then they ended up experiencing this tremendous academic growth that the teacher had been told that they would experience. And so the idea here is that perhaps these teachers' expectations led them to treat these kids slightly differently, right? And interestingly, the teachers didn't realize that they were doing this, right? This happened over the course of the year. They're given a little bit of information at the beginning of the academic year, and of course the teacher's not going to really be thinking about that actively the entire year, right? They forget about it, but it's in there. It's an expectation that they have, and their expectations are brought about in those students, right? And this is a really robust effect, right? Now, here's one of the crazy implications about this Pygmalion in the Classroom study, this Pygmalion effect. If you tell a teacher that a kid is, that you expect a kid to do well, then they will do well. But this also works in the opposite direction. If a teacher expects a child to fail, if a parent expects a child to do poorly, then the child will perform worse. This is a really powerful effect. People are not aware that they transmit these expectations to other people, but these expectations do have an effect, right? People aren't aware that they're affected by the expectations of other people. So with this information, it's really important to be aware of the power of expectations and your power to use those expectations to help other people, right? If you know that your expectations have an influence, then you can use those expectations to help other people, right? It's a really powerful effect, right? For example, if you spend your whole life telling a kid that they're bad at math, oh, you're just bad at math, then they will grow up to meet those expectations. If you tell a kid their whole life they're good at math, that they're good at everything, then they will meet those expectations. Likewise, if you treat other people as though they like you, if you assume that everyone likes you, then people will probably like you. If your expectation is that people aren't going to like you, then they probably won't like you, right? One of the conclusions here is these expectations are really powerful and they operate on a subconscious level, right? We aren't aware that we're transmitting these expectations to other people, and other people aren't aware that they're being influenced by these expectations. But the research evidence shows that this does happen. So that's it for today. Make sure that you take the quiz following the suggested method for taking the quiz in the syllabus. And also make sure you participate in this week's discussion before the deadline.